Welcome to ancient Egypt, a place of wonder, a place of legacy, a place where absolutely everything wanted to hurt you. We're about to take a long, quiet journey through a land of scorching sun, divine kings, dry bread, and bureaucratic nightmares. It's going to be slow, it's going to be sleepy, and yes, we're going to cover it all. The hot, gritty, overly spiritual, and deeply exhausting life of the average person in ancient Egypt, from birth to death, with plenty of awkward moments in between. So grab your linen tunic, dust off your sandals, and lie back in your straw mat bed, because this is going to be delightfully uneventful, and we won't be skipping the boring parts. In fact, that's kind of the point. If you enjoy slowly sinking into dusty corners of history, feel free to gently press the subscribe button. It helps this sleepy little channel grow and ensures you're first in line to learn about why bread gave people cavities in the Bronze Age. No pressure. We'll still be here, droning on about funerary customs at a safe, soothing pace. Now then, ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, pharaohs and papyrus, and yet also land of exhaustion, sandstorms, missing organs and mice. We often think of ancient Egypt as a grand civilization, and it was. It lasted for over 3,000 years, which is longer than any modern nation. They built cities, invented writing, mummified their dead, and constructed buildings that still confuse modern engineers. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about what it was like to live there. Not as a pharaoh, not as a priest, but as a person. Just an average, overworked, underfed, sunburned Egyptian, trying to get through the day, without being conscripted into hauling limestone blocks. Let's start with where you might be born. If you were lucky, you were born in a small mud brick house, somewhere along the Nile. Your mother delivered you at home. There were no hospitals, no sterile instruments, just experienced midwives, and the hope that everything would go according to plan. Infant mortality rates were high as 30 to 50% in some periods. If you made it through the first few months, you had a decent chance of reaching adulthood. And by adulthood, we mean maybe 30, possibly 40, and rarely 50. As a child, you didn't have toys in the modern sense. You might play with carved animals made of clay, little dolls with string hair, and possibly a ball made from papyrus fibre. But childhood didn't last long. By the age of 5 or 6, you were expected to start helping out. That meant chores, fieldwork, hauling water, or learning a trade if you were fortunate. There was no school for most children. Literacy was rare, reserved mostly for boys from elite families who might train as scribes. If you were a girl, your life was more confined. You learned household management, food preparation, weaving, and the complex spiritual art of being polite to your in-laws. You would likely marry by your early teens, not out of romance, out of practicality. Because the earlier you married, the sooner your family gained another helping hand. Most people were farmers. The land was technically owned by Pharaoh. You worked it, but it wasn't yours. You didn't choose what to grow. You grew what the state told you to grow, mostly wheat and barley. And when it came time to harvest, you had to give a hefty portion to the local tax collector. In grain, not in coins. Those didn't exist yet. Tax evasion wasn't an option. The state employed armies of scribes to record every measure of grain, every goat, every jar of beer, and if your quota was short, you could be fined, or worse, assigned to corvée labour. That's forced labour on state projects like building canals or temples. Food was simple. Your daily diet might include bread, beer, onions, dates, occasionally fish, rarely meat. Bread was coarse, often mixed with sand from grinding stones. That led to dental issues. Most mummies have severe tooth wear, abscesses and infections. Beer was thick, cloudy and nutritious. It was more like fermented porridge than a modern drink. Children drank it. Everyone did. Because Nile water wasn't exactly safe to sip raw. Your home was made of mud brick. It was hot in the summer, cold at night, and probably full of bugs. You had no toilet, just a hole in the ground or a corner outside. Bathing was done with water from the river or a communal basin. Soap? Kind of. A mix of animal fat and clay. You owned a few tunics. You went barefoot most of the time. Shoes were for special occasions, or the rich. If you were lucky, you had amulets for protection, carved from bone or stone, tied around your neck with reed twine. If you weren't lucky, you had sunburn and a mysterious rash you just hoped wasn't divine punishment. Religion touched every part of life. There were gods for the sun, the river, the harvest, the afterlife, childbirth, death, beer, cats, crocodiles, and more cats. Everything had a spiritual reason, a meaning, an explanation. Why didn't it rain? Because the gods were displeased. Why did your ox die? A curse? Or perhaps you forgot an offering? Religion wasn't abstract. It was daily maintenance, an ongoing negotiation between humans and divine forces. And the priests were busy. Temples weren't just religious centres. They were administrative headquarters, granaries, schools, libraries, banks and storehouses. And most people weren't allowed inside. So that's where we'll begin. A dusty world, a divine order, a heavy sun, and a lot of quiet suffering beneath the grandeur of stone temples. We'll go deeper into what it meant to live and die in this ancient civilization, where glory came at a cost and survival was its own kind of sacred ritual. But for now, close your eyes and let the warm air of the Nile brush past. We're just getting started. Childhood in ancient Egypt was short, simple, and strangely itchy. While modern childhood is filled with toys, cartoons, and school days, life as a child along the Nile was mostly about survival, mosquitoes, and doing your part, even if your part involved carrying jars twice your size. Let's drift slowly into the cradle of ancient civilization and look at what life was like for the youngest Egyptians, from birth to their first backache. Childbirth was risky, midwives oversaw deliveries, but there were no sterilized tools, no anesthesia, and no trained physicians in the modern sense. Mothers prayed to Taweret, the protective hippo goddess of childbirth, and to Bes, the dwarf god who scared away evil spirits. With his joyful grimace and aggressive tambourine playing, if the baby survived birth, it was immediately swaddled in linen, wiped down with natron or oil, and protected with amulets, sometimes shaped like frogs, lions, or the Eye of Horus. Many infants didn't survive. Diseases were rampant, clean water was unreliable, and tiny bodies were fragile in the harsh climate. But if you made it through your first few months, you joined a world teeming with gods, chores, bugs, and the occasional bread snack. Egyptian children didn't have much of a childhood, the way we think of it. By age 5 or 6, you were already helping with daily tasks, gathering reeds, fetching water, feeding animals, shooing flies, sweeping dust, even though more dust arrived 2 minutes later. Learning your parents' trade. Boys learned to farm, build or craft. Girls learned to cook, weave and manage the home. The concept of childhood as a carefree time simply didn't exist for most people. There was work, then more work, then sleep maybe. But not everything was toil. Archaeologists have uncovered toys made from wood, clay, linen, bone, string. Children played with animal figurines, dolls with painted hair and bead necklaces, balls made of papyrus or leather, spinning tops, simple board games. One popular game was Senet, an early form of strategy and chance played on a grid. It may have had spiritual significance, or it may have just been a good excuse to argue with your siblings. There were also games involving tag, running or wrestling, and plenty of mischief, as seen in ancient art showing children pulling each other's hair or trying to ride donkeys that clearly weren't in the mood. Children were typically naked until about age 10. Clothes were a luxury, and the hot climate made them optional for the very young. Hair was shaved or styled in side locks, one long braid on an otherwise bald head. It was a practical choice, cooler in the heat, easier to manage, and possibly meant to confuse lice. Parasites were common, so were skin infections, eye conditions, and ringworm. Children bathed in river water, which helped with the heat, but also brought its own microbial risks. To protect themselves, families used amulets, rituals, and incantations, because if your child had a fever, it wasn't bacteria. It was probably a demon in the blood. Children ate what adults ate: bread, beer, onions, dates, and legumes. The bread was coarse and full of grit. The beer was thick, cloudy, and only mildly alcoholic. More of a liquid meal than a beverage. Milk was available from cows or goats, but often spoiled quickly in the sun. Breastfeeding likely continued for several years, especially for families without access to clean food sources. There were no sweets, unless you count honey, which was rare and usually reserved for offerings or the wealthy. If you were hungry, you might sneak a fig. If you were unlucky, you bit into one with a wasp inside. If you were a boy born into a wealthy or priestly family, you might be sent to scribe school. You'd learn hieroglyphs, hieratic script for faster writing, Mathematics, religion, government protocols, how to be painfully precise with ink. Scribe school wasn't fun. You copied passages for hours. Mistakes meant beatings. Ink stains never came out of your linen. But if you succeeded, you earned a comfortable place in society, as one of the few literate people in a world full of farmers and goats. For girls, education was rare. They were expected to learn domestic skills, though some elite women could read and write, particularly priestesses or high-status wives. Most children, however, never saw a scroll. Their education came from observation, repetition, and being told not to put scorpions in the firewood again. Disease was constant. Common threats included malaria, diarrhea, measles, respiratory infections, parasites, eye diseases from dust and sunlight. Children were especially vulnerable. Burial sites show many small graves. Some were wrapped lovingly in linen, placed with toys or amulets, and inscribed with prayers for the afterlife. Even in hardship, love persisted. Parents mourned. Communities remembered. Because no matter how dusty the village, a lost child was a sacred sorrow. Children often played with animals. Cats were sacred and common, both pets and pest control. Dogs were used for herding and protection. Some families raised geese or monkeys. Others had trained ibises or even domesticated hyenas. Pets were loved. Some were buried with their owners. Others had their own amulets. One tomb includes a message to a deceased dog, thanking it for guarding the household faithfully. Children also believed in ghosts, spirits, and magical creatures. They carried charms to ward off evil, and knew not to wander too close to the edge of the Nile. Not because of crocodiles, but because the gods might be watching. So now, as you rest in your blanket of soft linen and artificial comfort, imagine being 5 years old, hauling a basket of figs across a sunburned courtyard, barefoot and sweaty, wondering why your toy lion only has 3 legs. Life was short, play was brief, but somehow, joy still found a way in. Sleep now. No one's asking you to fetch water from a crocodile-filled river. Your bread is grit-free, your amulets are in spirit only. Let's step softly into an ordinary home in ancient Egypt. It's not a palace, not a temple, just a small, dusty rectangle made of sun-baked mud brick, nestled in a cluster of others, all facing narrow alleyways, where goats occasionally get stuck. This was where most Egyptians lived. Not in pyramids, not in marble villas, but in modest homes filled with heat, laughter, smoke, and complaints about taxes. And today we're going to settle in, get comfortable, and quietly observe how a family survived. In a house that didn't even have a door that locked. Mud brick was the building material of choice. Why? Because it was cheap, easy to make, and very available. The basic ingredients, Nile mud, straw, water, elbow grease, formed into bricks, left to dry in the sun, and stacked together with little concern for insulation or personal space. Roofs were flat, made of palm logs and reeds. Perfect for drying food, sleeping during hot nights, or yelling at neighbours. Floors, mostly packed earth, sometimes paved with stone if you were wealthy, usually swept daily and still full of sand. Most homes had 1 or 2 rooms, a central cooking area, maybe a storage alcove, and possibly stairs to the roof. Windows were tiny if they existed at all. Glass didn't exist yet. Light came from oil lamps, which also filled the room with warm, fragrant smoke. The smell of the average Egyptian home was a blend of burning oil, cooked onions, goat fur, sweat, sand, and occasional incense when guests visited. Beds were a luxury. Most people slept on mats, piles of linen, woven reed platforms, the roof during hotter months. Pillows were curved wooden headrests. Not exactly cosy, but excellent for maintaining a stately posture in your dreams. Families slept together. Privacy wasn't expected. A home was one open-air experience of shared breath and foot space. There was no modern kitchen. Cooking happened outside or in a semi-open courtyard. To avoid filling the house with smoke, food was cooked in clay ovens or over open flame. Utensils were stone, clay or bronze. Pots were blackened with soot, and every meal required some degree of crouching, blowing on embers and swatting flies. Typical tools included mortar and pestle, grinding stones for grain, clay pots, wooden ladles, baskets for storage. The grindstone, called a quern, was used daily to make flour. It was slow, exhausting work, and the resulting flour was full of grit from the stone surface, which means you were chewing sand. with every meal. Breakfast, lunch and dinner were variations on a theme. Bread, beer, onions, garlic, lentils, dates, figures, cucumbers, occasionally fish, fowl or goat. Rarely beef or lamb. Milk was consumed but didn't keep well in the heat. Most dairy came in the form of cheese, salty, crumbly and stored in ceramic jars. Salt, herbs and spices existed, but were expensive. The average meal was bland, warm and crunchy with stray sand. No home was truly private. Neighbours dropped by, extended family visited. Priests might arrive for blessings, scribes might show up for tax records, and your cousin always seemed to need more grain. But the most consistent guests were pests. Flies buzzed endlessly. Mice chewed through storage baskets. Scorpions hid in corners. Lizards slithered behind pottery. Mosquitoes ruled the night. Amulets were placed near doorways. Cats were highly valued. And insect-repelling ointments were smeared generously, though not always effectively. There was no indoor plumbing. Water was fetched daily from the Nile or a nearby canal, carried in clay jars balanced on shoulders or heads. Bathing was done in courtyards or by the river. Soap was made from animal fat and clay or ash. Linen cloths were used to scrub the skin. Toilets were inventive. Some homes had clay toilet seats over ceramic pots. Others used simple pits in the ground. Waste was dumped outside or in designated areas, often with little enthusiasm. It smelled exactly like you'd expect. Home life involved endless repetition, grinding grain, hauling water, weaving cloth, spinning thread, baking bread, feeding animals, mending tunics, washing linen, chasing children, chasing chickens, chasing escaping goats, and sometimes chasing your patience. Weaving was done on vertical looms. Linen was the primary fabric, light, breathable, and always in need of patching. Cooking fires were lit each day, ashes swept, flies swatted, bread kneaded, beer brewed. It was a full-time job to simply exist. Families were tight-knit, usually consisting of parents, children, grandparents, and whoever else needed a roof that week. The father was typically the main labourer. The mother managed the household. Children helped as soon as they could walk and lift a basket. Marriage was common, but not formalised by state contracts. Couples simply agreed to live together. Divorce was possible. Remarriage was common. Life expectancy made it inevitable. Love existed. So did resentment. Ancient letters survive of husbands complaining to their wives and wives demanding better treatment. Which is to say, not much has changed. So lie still now. The hearth is warm, the fire crackles gently. Your neighbour is yelling about his missing goat, but it's too dark to care. You've finished your lentils, your headrest is properly curved, and the stars are beginning to shimmer above your flat, dusty roof. This was home. Not glamorous, not clean, but full of life. Messy, smelly, enduring life. Sleep now. The flies are quiet. The oven is cool, and your neighbours will probably wait until dawn to argue again. Let's turn now to the art of appearance. In a world of relentless sun, swirling sand, and no modern plumbing, the ancient Egyptians still managed to look surprisingly put together. They were clean, or tried to be. They valued beauty, scent, and smooth skin, even when their homes didn't have doors and their daily job involved carrying baskets of dung. Today we'll slip quietly into their world of makeup, hygiene rituals, wigs and wigs for your wigs. Because looking good was sacred. The average Egyptian wardrobe was minimalist. Think early linen core. Linen was the fabric of choice. It was light, breathable, and made from flax fibres. Flax was grown along the Nile, harvested, soaked, pounded, spun, and woven into garments that kept you only slightly cooler than being naked. Men typically wore short kilts or wraparound skirts, occasionally tunics, sometimes nothing at all, especially when labouring. Women typically wore long-sheath dresses with shoulder straps, sometimes with pleats or beads if they were wealthier, occasionally decorative sashes. Children, often nude until around age 10, because why waste a good tunic on someone who rolls in the mud? There were no zippers, no buttons, just ties, knots, and the occasional awkward wardrobe adjustment in public. Most Egyptians went barefoot. Sandals were reserved for the elite, religious ceremonies, visits to temples, getting yelled at by your mother. Sandals were made of woven papyrus or leather. They wore out quickly, and they weren't great for desert terrain, which is why most people preferred to toughen their feet and complain later. The climate was hot, hair was sweaty, and lice were everywhere. So people often shaved their heads, men, women, and children. To compensate, they wore wigs. Wigs were made of human hair, wool, plant fibres, and beeswax. They were styled elaborately: braids, curls, beads, scented cones. Yes, you heard that right. Scented wax cones were placed atop the wig and slowly melted throughout the day, releasing perfumed oil that dripped onto your scalp. Fashion, but practical, and slightly gooey. Smoothness was divine. Hair was seen as impure, so people shaved faces, heads, bodies, possibly eyebrows. Jury's still out. Razors were made of bronze. Tweezer-like tools existed for detail work, and some wealthier individuals even had personal groomers whose job was to keep them silky and spiritual. There were no bathtubs, no showers, no hot water heaters, so bathing was done with water from the Nile, clay basins, jars poured by hand, and a lot of scrubbing. Soap wasn't quite soap. It was a paste made of animal fat, ash, clay, sometimes scented herbs. Exfoliation was performed using sand, stones, rough cloth, salt-based scrubs. The goal? Stay clean. Or at least smell slightly less like fermented onions. Both men and women wore makeup, daily, religiously. Kohl eyeliner was iconic, a black cosmetic made of galena, lead ore, soot, oil or animal fat. It was applied around the eyes with a stick or small spoon. Why? To protect from sun glare, to repel flies, to honour the gods, to look fabulous. Other cosmetics included green malachite powder for eyeshadow, red ochre for lips and cheeks, henna for nails and hair, scented oils for skin. Cosmetics were stored in carved jars, shells, or ivory palettes. Applying them was a ritual, a daily spell of self-respect in a dusty world. Smelling good was considered godly, so Egyptians created perfumed oils, balms, and incense. Common sense, myrrh, frankincense, lotus, cinnamon, marjoram, honey. Perfume was worn on the skin, in hair, on wigs, in cones, on clothes, and sometimes on cats if they'd sit still. Temples used scent in rituals, priests anointed statues, commoners anointed themselves, because if you were going to get buried under bureaucracy, you might as well smell like flowers. The desert sun was brutal, so skincare was essential. Common products included castor oil, moringa oil, beeswax balms, clay masks, honey pastes, milk baths for the elite. Wrinkles and blemishes were considered signs of aging and spiritual impurity, so people worked hard to stay supple, which means, yes, even in 1400 BCE, there was pressure to look younger. Mirrors were made of polished bronze, smooth, circular, and often mounted on ivory or wood handles. They weren't crystal clear, but good enough to check if your kohl was smudged, if your wig was crooked, or if your priestly neighbour had a better linen tunic. Vanity wasn't just accepted, it was divine. Looking presentable meant respecting the gods, your ancestors, and your reflection. So now, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine lying on a stone bench while someone massages your feet with lotus oil, combs your hair, and dusts your cheeks with crushed rose petals and copper powder. The desert may have been cruel, but self-care was sacred. Sleep now. Your wig is straight, your kohl is even, and your scented wax cone is melting, very slowly. Before Uber Eats, before refrigerators, before the concept of a food court, there was ancient Egypt. And while Egyptian cuisine may sound exotic and fragrant in theory, dates, honey, leeks, and wine, for most people it was a repetitive, tooth-eroding ordeal held together with onions, sand, and sorrow. Tonight, we'll dine like a commoner, we'll chew slowly, grind patiently, and accept that some meals are best left forgotten. Bon appétit, or something like that. The absolute staple of the Egyptian diet was bread. Every meal, every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Made from emmer wheat or barley, the bread was dense, coarse, often flat, and nearly always filled with grit. Why? Because the grain was ground by hand using quern stones, which slowly wore down and left behind tiny bits of stone dust in the flour. So essentially, every bite included a free dental exfoliation. The bread could be baked into loaves, rolled into balls, fried like pancakes, or left to ferment slightly. Sometimes flavoured with dates, figures, onions, herbs, or, when desperate, dreams of flavour. If bread was the food of the people, beer was their drink of survival. Made from partially baked barley bread, crumbled into water, fermented and strained, Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and nutritious. It was more of a liquid meal than a beverage. It came with residual grain mush, floating chunks, and, if filtered poorly, the occasional surprise. Children drank beer, adults drank beer, priests blessed beer, and offerings to the dead included beer. It was the lifeblood of the working class, safer than Nile water, easier than chewing dry grain, and just alcoholic enough to soften the ache of pyramid building. Meat was rare, fish was common, but vegetables, they were dependable. The average diet included onions, they loved onions, garlic, ditto, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, radishes, chickpeas, lentils, fried, stewed, mashed or stuffed, sometimes raw, often smelly, always present. The pyramid builders at Giza were famously fed a diet rich in onions and garlic. Whether that fueled their strength or ruined their breath, we may never know. Sugar didn't exist yet, but they had honey. Rare, expensive, precious honey, collected from wild hives or kept in clay hives near homes. It was used in cakes, beer flavouring, medicine, religious offerings, bribery of cranky children, other natural sweets, dates, sticky and rich, figs, soft and seedy, carob pods, chewy and confusing, grapes, when in season, and if you knew someone. There were no chocolate pyramids, no frosting, no caramel drizzle, just nature's candy, usually covered in ants. Most people didn't eat meat regularly. It was expensive to raise, butcher, and store in the heat. When meat was consumed, it was usually duck, goose, fish, goat, or wild game if you were feeling lucky. Beef was sacred, often reserved for the gods or elite banquets. Fish was more common for riverside families, grilled, sun-dried, or smoked over palm fronds, and sometimes salted to prolong its tragic lifespan by another week or two. Pigs existed, but were viewed with suspicion by priests and elites. They were mostly avoided, except by people who didn't care about spiritual cholesterol. Beer was for everyone. Wine was for the upper crust. Made from grapes stored in amphorae, sometimes flavoured with herbs, resins, or dates. Wine was a social flex. You drank it at festivals, shared it with guests, and offered it to the gods, after taking a generous sip yourself. Some wine labels have survived, with tasting notes written in hieratic script. Smooth, balanced, pairs well with mummification rituals. Probably, without refrigeration, spices were luxury goods, but Egyptians still sought flavour where they could. Common seasonings included salt, from desert salt pans, coriander, dill, mustard seeds, fenugreek, mint, rue, and natron, when someone confused it for salt again. Meat and fish were often salted or pickled. Bread was dipped in oil or mashed legumes, and even beer could be spiced if you were bold and had a strong stomach. There were no forks, no chopsticks, no fine china. You ate with your hands, maybe a spoon, and definitely a lot of napkinless confidence. Meals were communal, people squatted or sat on mats. Large dishes were shared, drinks passed around. Everyone knew whose fingers were the least clean, and still shared anyway. Burp? No big deal. Talk with your mouth full if you must, just don't spill the beer, or the gods might notice. That gritty bread we mentioned, it destroyed teeth. Mummies of all social classes show worn enamel, abscesses, missing molars, and chronic infections. There were no dentists. Toothaches were treated with magic spells, clove oil, willow bark, or simply prayer and grim acceptance. Some scholars believe people just got used to it. A life of chewing carefully, wincing occasionally, and not complaining too loudly. So now, as you lie comfortably full on your modern bed, imagine grinding grain for an hour, kneading dough with tired arms, and biting into a warm, comforting loaf that secretly wants to shatter your molars. Dinner in ancient Egypt, never spicy, rarely meaty, but always memorable. Sleep now, your beer is thick, your figs are ripe, and the sand in your sandwich is just historical seasoning. Let's rise before dawn, stretch stiff muscles, wrap a linen kilt around your waist, and shuffle out into the sun-baked dust to begin another day of soul-numbing, spine-destroying labour. Because in ancient Egypt, if you weren't royalty, you were working. There were no vacations, no ergonomic chairs, no 5-hour energy drinks. There was just heat, stone, sweat, and prayer. So let's slowly punch the world's oldest time card and explore how ancient people earned their daily bread and their daily backache. The vast majority of Egyptians were not priests, nobles, or scribes. They were labourers, manual, repetitive, often invisible workers who carried the civilization forward on tired shoulders. Jobs included farmers, builders, fishermen, bakers, weavers, potters, sailors, servants, scribes, for the lucky literate few, and professional mourners, yes, really. Each one essential, each one exhausting, none of them eligible for early retirement. Farming in Egypt was both a gift and a punishment. The annual Nile flood brought rich silt and moisture, turning desert into farmland. But it also meant watching the river daily, rebuilding irrigation channels, digging trenches, carrying baskets of soil, planting by hand, harvesting under the sun, paying taxes in grain. The state owned the land, you worked it. In good years you scraped by, in bad years you starved. Tools included wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, stone sickles, reed baskets, bare hands, no tractors, no gloves. Just aching fingers and mud between your toes. Egypt's monuments are eternal. But the backs that built them were not. Builders were conscripted labourers, sometimes seasonal farmers during the off-season, sometimes full-time stone haulers. They moved massive limestone blocks, granite obelisks, mud brick pallets, sand by the handful, forever. Contrary to myth, they weren't usually slaves. They were paid in rations, bread, beer, onions, sometimes fish. But the work was brutal, heatstroke, crushed limbs, falls from scaffolding, blisters, dust inhalation, and the general horror of someone saying, "Can you move that obelisk just a little to the left?" They built pyramids, temples, and tombs, then walked home to their mud brick cottages and collapsed. If you could read and write, you held a golden ticket. Scribes were educated from a young age. They learned hieroglyphs, hieratic script, and the art of bureaucracy. Their jobs included recording taxes, writing letters, cataloguing temple goods, drafting legal contracts, copying religious texts, and generally being everyone's least favourite co-worker. They worked in shaded chambers while others sweated outside, but they weren't immune to pain. Endless writing on papyrus led to hand cramps, back strain, eye fatigue, ink-stained tunics. And if you misspelled Pharaoh's name, let's not even go there. Women were expected to manage households, weave linen, make bread, fetch water, care for children, feed animals, prepare offerings, maintain cleanliness, and never ever stop moving. Some also worked outside the home as midwives, musicians, priestesses, perfume makers, beer brewers, textile merchants. Elite women could wield power. Most women wielded brooms and mortars. Marriage didn't end labour, it just added more tasks, especially when your husband brought home another goat without building another pen. Fishermen cast nets or used spears from papyrus boats. They caught tilapia, catfish, Nile perch, or sometimes nothing. Hunters used bows, slings, or dogs to catch birds and small game. Dangerous? Occasionally. Rewarding? Barely. Herders moved livestock through heat and sand. They guided goats, cattle, and pigs, and sometimes just followed behind cleaning up poop. A curious profession, wailing for the dead. Hired mourners, mostly women, attended funerals, pulled their hair, threw dust on themselves, sang lamentations, and wept dramatically. Some were trained in specific mourning chants, others were simply loud. They gave grief a voice, even if it cost extra. There were no coins, no wallets. Wages came in goods, not currency. You were paid in bread, beer, onions, fish, cloth, oil, occasionally land if you were truly blessed. But taxes were always lurking. You paid the state, in grain, in linen, in livestock, in labour. And the tax collector always knew exactly how many goats you had. If your job was temple-based, you worked not for money, but for Mayat, the divine balance. Priests performed endless ceremonies, bathing statues, lighting incense, reciting prayers, Feeding offerings to gods, cleaning sacred spaces, keeping cosmic order intact, it was spiritual, but also exhausting. And if you messed up the ritual, there was a spell for that, and another ritual to fix the ritual. So rest now. You've woven linen until your fingers blistered. You've hauled stones until your knees cracked. You've baked enough bread to feed the dead. Labour in ancient Egypt was not glamorous. It was constant, it was sacred, it was painful, and yet it built an empire that still casts shadows on our history. Sleep now. The tools are down. The quern is silent. The oxen are snoring. You've earned your rest, even if Pharaoh disagrees. Before you even opened your eyes in ancient Egypt, you were already part of a divine arrangement. From the moment you were born, your life was wrapped in ritual, prayer, incense, and cosmic negotiation. Because if the gods weren't pleased, your crops might fail, your beer might sour, or your cat might never forgive you. Today we shuffle softly into the vast and crowded pantheon of gods, demons, spirits, and sacred baboons. Because spiritual peace in Egypt required a little effort and a lot of offerings. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't a Sunday event. It was every day, every hour, in every breath. It shaped how you dressed, what you ate, where you went, what you feared, how you died, and what happened after. The gods were always watching, always hungry, always in need of incense, praise, and fresh bread. You didn't believe in them, you served them. There wasn't just one god, there were so many. Depending on the time period and region, Egyptians worshipped hundreds of deities. Some of the regulars included Ra, sun god, solar boat captain, eyeball enthusiast; Osiris, god of the underworld and judge of the dead; Isis, magical mother, wife of Osiris, expert mourner; Horus, falcon-headed sky warrior, part-time kingmaker; Anubis, jackal-headed embalmer, soul-weighing specialist; Thoth, ibis-headed scribe of the gods, inventor of writing; Hathor, goddess of love, music, dancing, and cow imagery; Set, god of chaos, storms, and questionable family values; Ta, creator god of craftsmen and quiet confidence; Bastet, feline goddess of protection, music, and naps; Amun, the hidden one, often fused with Ra, very powerful. And those were just the popular ones. Each town had its own local god. Each profession had its divine patron. Each animal had a symbolic role. Even scarabs were sacred. You couldn't walk 10 feet without spiritually offending something. Temples were not places for community worship. They were the homes of gods. Only priests could enter the sacred inner sanctums. Only they could dress the gods' statues, feed them meals which were later redistributed, perform daily purification rituals, sing hymns, burn incense, recite protective spells. Priests followed strict rules: daily bathing, shaving all body hair, wearing pure linen, abstaining from certain foods and activities, keeping their sandals very clean. If the god statue was dusty, that was a cosmic crisis. Every day the sun rose because Ra sailed his celestial boat across the sky. Every night he fought Apophis, the chaos serpent in the underworld. If Ra won, morning returned. If he lost, well, let's just say you didn't want that. So priests and even commoners performed rituals to help Ra succeed. Lighting lamps, chanting spells, offering bread, beer, and onions, whispering invocations to keep Apophis tired and confused, spiritual teamwork, all before breakfast. You didn't need a temple to practice religion. Most households had. Small shrines, figurines, painted walls, offering bowls. Common household deities included Bes, a dwarf god who scared away evil spirits with his face; Tawere, part hippo, part lion, part crocodile, protector of mothers and babies; Heket, frog goddess of fertility; Khnum, potter god who shaped humans from clay on a divine wheel. You offered them beer, fruit, milk, incense, and the occasional awkward song, because you needed their protection from disease, nightmares, burglars, and crocodiles. Protection wasn't passive, you wore it. Amulets were everywhere. They were hung in homes, tucked in tunics, woven into jewellery, placed under pillows, packed in tombs. Popular designs included the Eye of Horus, health, protection, and good vision; the scarab beetle, rebirth and transformation; the Ankh, symbol of life; the Jed pillar, stability and backbone strength; the Was scepter, power and authority. Some amulets were mass-produced. Others were blessed by priests. All of them were believed to work better than just crossing your fingers. Magic was not just for drama, it was a daily necessity. Egyptians used Heka, the spiritual force that powered all rituals. Everything had to be in harmony. So spells were cast for safe childbirth, good crops, clear dreams, snake bites, pestilence, annoying neighbours, and even washing your hands. You could hire a healer priest or chant the spells yourself. Some were written on papyri, others were passed down orally or carved on walls. Words had power. Mispronounce something and the gods might raise an eyebrow. The afterlife wasn't automatic. You had to earn it. When you died, your soul was judged. Your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and order. If your heart was light, you passed. If it was heavy with sin, it was eaten by Amit, a demon with the body of a lion, crocodile, and hippo. To prepare, people memorized or purchased Book of the Dead spells. These included how to greet underworld gatekeepers, what to say to Osiris, how to avoid the lake of fire, how to identify a friendly crocodile spirit, and how to make sure your own shadow didn't betray you. No pressure. Egyptians believed the world was full of unseen dangers, evil spirits, ghosts, curses, snake gods, vindictive ancestors, possessed furniture, maybe. To ward them off, people used incantations, statues, protective walls of text, loud clapping, yes, really, and lots of shouting the names of powerful gods. It wasn't always peaceful, but it was thorough. So now, as your eyelids grow heavier, know that you've pleased the gods today. You've lit the incense, you've muttered the spell correctly, you've made your peace with the hippo-faced protector beside your bed. Sleep came slowly in Egypt, but when it did, it was guarded by deities and warded by charms and whispered over by priests who didn't mind repeating the same chant for the 400th time that month. Sleep now, the spirits are calm, the amulets are glowing, and Apophis is taking the night off. Your back hurts, your stomach's off, and your third molar feels like it's trying to explode. Welcome to ancient Egyptian healthcare. They were pioneers of medicine. Yes, they recorded diagnoses, created surgical tools, and even had doctors specializing in body parts. But despite their knowledge, you still didn't want to get sick. Because in a land where sand filled your bread and crocodiles swam in your drinking water, illness was inevitable, and treatments were imaginative. Let's lie back now, as the healer approaches with ointment, prayers, and a jar full of honey-soaked lizard bones. Egyptians believed that sickness came from two sources: physical causes, like wounds, parasites, or bad food; spiritual causes, angry gods, curses, or evil spirits. So their medicine combined practical treatment, magic spells, herbal remedies, divine intervention. A papyrus scroll might tell you to wash the wound with honey, apply resin, say a prayer to Sekhmet, burn incense, and wear a frog-shaped amulet on your left ankle, just in case. The Egyptians recorded medicine in great detail. The most famous medical papyri include the Ebers Papyrus, a 20-metre-long scroll with over 700 remedies; the Edwin Smith Papyrus, focused on surgery and trauma; the Cahoon Papyrus, gynecology and veterinary care; the Hearst Papyrus, focused on digestion and other mysteries. These texts offered diagnoses based on symptoms, prognoses, some hopeful, some very not, prescriptions and procedures, magical spells for backup. They knew about the heart and vessels, the pulse, the liver, lungs and stomach. Even the brain, though they weren't sure what it did. Spoiler, they thought the brain cooled the blood. The heart, they believed, did all the thinking, which explains a lot about their love letters. Egyptian treatments could be practical, but they could also be alarming. Common ingredients included honey, antibacterial and delicious; frankincense and myrrh, antiseptic and aromatic; onion and garlic, internal cleansers; castor oil for, well, everything; mouldy bread, an early antibiotic; copper salts for wounds; natron for cleansing and drying; animal fat for base salves; date wine to clean wounds. Less comforting ingredients: crocodile dung, ox organs, lizard blood, crushed flies, donkey hair, burnt bread crust, human skull fragments, powdered. And yes, they sometimes prescribed urine, warm, fresh, hopefully your own. If you've ever had a toothache, you might be tempted to time travel, but don't. Egyptian dental health was terrible, thanks to gritty bread, stone ground flour, lack of dental hygiene, high-carb diets. Most adults suffered from worn enamel, broken teeth, abscesses, infections, chronic pain. Treatments included poultices of honey and herbs, incantations, massages to the jaw, and occasionally yanking the tooth with copper tools. There were no fillings, no numbing agents, no dental floss, just courage and screaming. Egyptians understood wounds. Soldiers got injured. Farmers cut themselves. Builders fell. Healers treated cuts, bruises, dislocations, broken bones, burns, snake bites. They used linen bandages, honey salves, herbal compresses, bronze scalpels, stitches using linen thread, bone splints made from wood or reeds, but surgery was limited. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just bravery and prayer. And if you sneezed mid-procedure, well, there's a spell for that. Cleanliness was sacred. Priests bathed multiple times daily. Commoners washed with Nile water and soap paste. Clothes were scrubbed. Oil was applied to skin to prevent dryness and parasites. Diet was also part of prevention. Figs and dates for energy. Garlic for immunity. Beer to avoid contaminated water. Onions, just because they really believed in onions. People also used eye drops made from coal. Emetics to induce vomiting. Enemas administered by temple specialists. Purging routines based on lunar calendars. If it felt awful, they assumed it was working. Giving birth was risky, very risky, but Egypt had midwives, experienced women guiding labour, birthing bricks, platforms where women squatted to deliver, gods like Taweret and Bez to protect mother and baby, amulets to ward off evil spirits targeting newborns. After birth, babies were swaddled in linen, nursed for years and guarded fiercely, because infant mortality was high, and you needed at least 3 kids to survive into adulthood with one. No treatment was complete without magic. Healers used spoken incantations, written charms on papyrus, statues of healing gods, healing wands carved with snakes and lions, potions stirred while chanting. Some spells were incredibly specific. If his head throbs, say this to his bones. O pain, flee, I spit upon your mother, return to the darkness whence you came. Effective? Maybe, but at least you felt heard. If healing failed, you prepared for death like a bureaucratic ritual. Purify the body, hire embalmers, remove the brain through the nose, pack the organs in jars, wrap the limbs with prayers, call the priest, pay the fees, recite the Book of the Dead, and hope your heart was light. Even in death you could still mess things up. So the goal was to die clean, wrapped, and spell compliant. So lie still now. Let the healer hum over you. Let the salve cool your skin. Let the incense smoke chase away your fever dreams. Health in Egypt was a blend of knowledge and desperation. They tried. With herbs, with hope, with crocodile dung. And sometimes that was enough. Sleep now, your pulse is strong, your teeth are quiet, and your soul has swallowed its amulet. You're small, barefoot, and likely very dusty. You're an Egyptian child born into a world of blazing suns, stern gods, grinding grain, and swarms of flies. But what was life really like for kids in ancient Egypt? Did they play? Did they work? Did they enjoy their time before adulthood slammed in like a sandstorm? Tonight, let's travel slowly and barefoot through the fields and courtyards of childhood, through lullabies, chores, scrapes, games, and early marriages. Because in the land of the pharaohs, you didn't stay a child for long. The moment you were born, your survival became a community effort. Infant mortality was high. Birth was dangerous for both mother and child. To protect newborns, families prayed to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, hung amulets shaped like frogs or lions, rubbed protective oils on the baby's skin, gave offerings of milk, dates or honey, drew sacred symbols on walls and cradles. Babies were nursed, often for several years. There were no bottles, no diapers, just attentive mothers, helpful sisters, and linen cloths reused constantly. They were carried on hips, rocked in reed baskets and wrapped in amulets. For the first decade or so of your life, you were usually naked. Not because of poverty, but because it was practical. The heat made clothes unnecessary. Cloth was valuable and limited, and laundry was effort. Children ran free in the mud, sand, and gardens. They wore amulets, bracelets, beaded collars, and the occasional charm for protection. Boys often had shaved heads with a single side lock of hair, The lock of youth. It was a mark of childhood, and a terrible haircut in hindsight. Children played. A lot. Even in a society obsessed with labour and death, kids found time to laugh. Toys included clay dolls, animal figurines, wooden pull toys, rattles, balls made of leather or reeds, spinning tops, board games, like Senet. They played tag and wrestling, jumping contests, balancing acts, water games, imaginative play with mini chariots or temple models. There were no screen time limits, because the only screen was the sky. Playtime ended quickly. By age 7 or 8, you were expected to help. Boys followed their fathers to fields, workshops, boats, quarries. Girls helped their mothers with grinding grain, weaving, cooking, carrying water, tending younger siblings. There was no teenage phase, no middle school rebellion, just a slow transformation from child to worker, driven by duty and survival. Most children weren't formally educated, but those from elite or scribe families went to houses of instruction. There they learned hieroglyphs and hieratic script, math, religious texts, storytelling, etiquette, memorization of proverbs like, "A boy's ear is on his back, he listens when he is beaten." Corporal punishment was common. Mistakes meant lashes. Excellence meant extra papyrus to copy. It wasn't fun, but it was a way up the social ladder. Girls rarely attended formal schools, but some learned to read and write at home, especially in priestly or noble families. Children ate what their parents ate, mostly bread, beer, vegetables, and occasional meat or fish. Meals were informal. You sat with your family, squatted on mats or stone benches, and dipped your fingers into shared bowls. There were no kid-friendly snacks, no juice boxes, but honey-soaked dates, a good bribe. Children were considered vulnerable to evil spirits, demons, envious stares, bad dreams, and the occasional ghostly uncle. So they wore amulets shaped like frogs, eyes, cats, or beetles, magical knots tied in linen, painted charms around their wrists and ankles, necklaces blessed by priests. Parents whispered prayers over sleeping babies, lit protective lamps, and placed spells near cribs. Because a shadow in the corner could mean something far worse than just a breeze. By age 12 or 13, many girls were considered ready for marriage. Boys were expected to start earning. Puberty marked adulthood. There were no teenagers, no high school dramas, no prom. Girls moved into their husbands' homes, became mothers quickly, and shouldered adult responsibilities early. Boys began their trades, took oaths, or joined the temple system if they were literate and chosen. Adulthood came with full-length clothes, responsibilities, and the slow realization that your childhood ended without much ceremony. Not all made it. Child mortality was high, disease, injury, and malnutrition were constant threats. But when a child died, they were mourned deeply. Families buried them with toys, amulets, miniature furniture, offerings for the afterlife, prayers for rebirth in the field of reeds. They were not forgotten, their names were spoken, their spirits protected siblings still living. So now imagine yourself beneath a fig tree, feet dusty, hands sticky from dates, laughing with friends beside the Nile. You've got a frog amulet around your neck. Your father is calling you to fetch water. You pretend not to hear. Life was short, but in those childhood moments, life was soft. Sleep now. The dolls are resting, the river games are done, and your mother is humming you a spell, just in case. You're standing under a date palm. There are no tuxedos, no wedding cakes, no rings carved from diamonds. But congratulations, you're getting married in ancient Egypt. Marriage was less about romance and more about household economics, continuing the family line and not eating lentils alone in old age. Tonight, we enter the warm, clay-walled world of ancient relationships, where love poems were whispered, arguments echoed through courtyards, and divorce came with laundry disputes. Because even thousands of years ago, partnership was both comforting and complicated. Marriage wasn't a sacred ritual. It was a civil contract, an agreement. There was no temple ceremony, no priestly vows, no required witnesses, though often present. No written contract required, though sometimes used. You simply moved in together, maybe exchanged gifts, and told the neighbours. Sometimes a written contract specified a division of property, dowry arrangements, child custody if divorced, mutual responsibilities. Simple, practical, binding, enough. Girls typically married between 12 to 14 years old, often soon after puberty. Boys married slightly later, often in their late teens or early 20s, once they could support a household. The age gap varied, but the expectations did not. Once married, you became a manager of the home, if female, a provider and protector, if male, and the rest was life. A dowry wasn't always mandatory, but often included linen, jewellery, cosmetic items, household tools, livestock, if wealthy, and some sort of insurance in case of separation. Grooms offered tokens of affection, practical tools, housing, and sometimes a servant or two. Families discussed, neighbours gossiped, goats wandered through the conversation, and once agreed, the couple moved in together and began their joint venture into marriage and misaligned sleeping schedules. The home was a modest affair, 1 to 3 rooms, mud brick construction, reed mats for sleeping, clay stoves for cooking, jars for storage, maybe a courtyard, maybe a rooftop for sleeping during hot nights. Wives oversaw, grinding grain, brewing beer, cooking meals, managing children, weaving linen, organising offerings. Husbands worked, managed trade or labour, repaired tools, paid taxes, haggled, occasionally napped when no one was looking. While marriage was practical, love did exist. Poetry from the New Kingdom reveals passionate affection. Your love has stolen my heart, like a thief in the darkness. I wish I were your laundryman so I could wash your linen and touch your thighs. Subtle, not always, sincere, usually, romantic, in a gritty, clay-filled way. Couples gave each other jewellery, shared figs and pomegranates, whispered over shared wine, argued about the price of onions, cared deeply despite the dust. Love was not idealised, it was daily, it was labour, it was affection wrapped in chores. The primary purpose of marriage was often children, heirs, helpers, and, in a very real sense, retirement plans. Children were considered gifts from the gods, signs of divine favour, providers of lineage continuity. Large families were common, miscarriages and infant deaths were also common, so couples tried and tried again. A barren marriage often led to prayers to fertility gods, magical amulets, rituals with priests, or in some cases a second wife. Not every marriage was blissful. Disputes happened, often recorded in letters, contracts and court documents. Common complaints: she cursed me in front of the neighbours. He took the bread and gave it to another woman. She threw my sandals out the door. He beat the servant and scared the baby. She refuses to grind the grain. He won't stop drinking beer and singing badly. Neighbours intervened, family members mediated, and sometimes things escalated. Divorce was legal and common. Either partner could initiate it. There was no religious penalty, no social ostracisation, though gossip certainly flowed. If a woman divorced, she often kept her dowry. She retained custody of small children. She returned to her family. She might remarry. Divorce settlements were recorded in contracts and sometimes included clauses like, he shall give her 1 sack of barley per month and leave her alone when she visits the temple. It was civilised, in theory. Oddly enough, pets played a role in domestic life. Cats were sacred but also family members. They slept on the bed, chased pests, sat in windows judging everyone. Some love poems even compared spouses to cats. My love is like a cat who curls beside me and bites when I forget the fish. Dogs, monkeys and birds also lived in homes, often more loyal than in-laws. When a spouse died, the survivor inherited property. Widows retained power in the home. Some even ran businesses, vineyards or estates. Remarriage was common, but grief was real. Widows wore mourning linen, hired professional mourners, maintained tomb offerings, and occasionally swore off future husbands, but only temporarily. So now imagine yourself sitting in a reed chair, your partner beside you, arguing over lentil stew as the cat knocks over a jar. You both sigh, you both laugh, you both go to bed beneath the stars and the hum of temple chants in the distance. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and often loud. Sleep now. Your spouse is humming, the cat is purring, and no one is asking you to fetch water, for now. You're tiptoeing through the shadows, hand trembling, breath shallow, a crude chisel in your fist and a growing sense of dread. You're not a hero, you're a tomb robber. Or maybe you're just a baker caught selling underweight loaves, or a servant who broke a sacred vase. In ancient Egypt, crime didn't always mean murder. But punishment was always memorable. Tonight, we sneak into the darker alleys of Egyptian justice, the scrolls of stolen grain, false oaths, and eternal curses. Because breaking the law in a land of gods meant you answered to men, priests, and possibly a crocodile. In a land so obsessed with order, Ma'at, crime was considered a tear in the cosmic fabric. Common offences included theft, especially grain, linen, or livestock; tomb robbing, very common despite curses; fraud, false testimony, adultery, assault, tax evasion, destroying property, blasphemy or impiety, magic without permission. Even gossip could be punished if it threatened the social hierarchy. Egypt's legal system was robust. No lawyers, no powdered wigs, but plenty of scribes and judges. Local courts were held in village halls, temple chambers, governors' residences. Officials included the local mayor, high priests, scribes of justice, in serious cases the vizier, prime minister. Trials were usually swift. Evidence was presented, witnesses were called, accusations written, and judgment handed down with precision. There was no jury, only a judge, often backed by divine authority. Evidence came in many forms: witness testimonies, written contracts, property seals, footprints, stolen goods found in possession, confessions, often extracted. Sometimes divine oracles were consulted. A priest would ask a god statue a yes or no question. The statue, carried on poles, would nod or shake, via subtle movement of the priests. Was it accurate? Well, the god always agreed with the high priest. Punishment varied by crime, class, and mood of the judge. For minor crimes, fines, public beatings, forced labour, temporary exile; for serious offences, mutilation, ears, nose, tongue. Branding, removal of property. Whipping, sometimes hundreds of lashes. Death by drowning, burning, or impalement. And if you robbed a tomb, you might be executed. Tortured for names, cursed eternally, or made into an example. Your body hung near the necropolis as a warning. Using Heka, magic, was normal. But using it illegally, that was a crime. Unauthorized spells could harm others, summon spirits, curse fields, cause disease, influence love without permission. Accused sorcerers were interrogated, scrolls confiscated, amulets burned, and sometimes the spells were tested. If they worked, that was proof of guilt, a classic no-win scenario. Adultery wasn't just a family issue, it was a legal and moral offence. Men were expected to be discreet, women were expected to be faithful. If caught, wives could be divorced without compensation. Lovers could be punished with beatings, mutilation or exile. Property could be seized. Children declared illegitimate. Divorce itself was legal and common, but if cheating was involved, the consequences went beyond heartbreak. During the 20th dynasty, Egypt faced economic collapse. Tombs were robbed on an industrial scale. In the Abbott Papyrus we find detailed accounts. Officials investigating royal tombs, broken seals, missing treasures, stripped mummies, labourers, guards, and even priests accused. Torture used to extract confessions. Elaborate cover-ups attempted by high-ranking officials. It reads like a crime thriller, but with more mummified suspects. Some confessed to burning the linen, stealing the amulets, and throwing the body into the fire. Justice was harsh, sometimes public, sometimes quietly ignored. Even in the age of pyramids there was paperwork. Scribes kept tax records, grain logs, land deeds, labour rosters, marriage contracts, court transcripts. Tampering with records was criminal. Lying to a scribe could backfire spectacularly. One preserved letter accuses a man of falsifying the count of ducks. Where there were 12, he recorded 5. A duck discrepancy, a potential scandal. If earthly justice didn't get you, the afterlife might. When you died, your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If light, eternal peace. If heavy, devoured by Ammit, the soul-eating demon. Liars, thieves, and oath-breakers were believed to face eternal hunger, fiery pits, beheading, again, or wandering the afterlife without a name. Spells in the Book of the Dead often included denials like, "I have not stolen, I have not slain. I have not polluted the river. I have not taken the bread of the gods. Just in case the gods were listening. So now slink quietly back from the tomb entrance, set down the chisel, return the stolen amulet, and pretend you were just looking for your goat. Justice in Egypt was stern, spiritual, and often very final. Sleep now, the guards are gone, the scribes have closed their scrolls, and your heart is still lighter than a feather. You've died, hopefully, peacefully, more likely during a sandstorm or from infected bread or perhaps snake-related misfortune. But death in ancient Egypt wasn't an end. It was a bureaucratic process, a spiritual maze, a checklist. And even in the afterlife, you weren't allowed to just rest. Tonight, we take the slow procession from this world into the next. A journey through linen wrapping, canopic jars, spiritual passports, and post-mortem paperwork. Because in Egypt, dying was only step one. When someone died, the home fell into mourning. Family members tore their clothes, covered their heads in dust, wept loudly, often in rehearsed wails. Sometimes hired professional mourners to boost emotional volume. Then began the process. You weren't just buried, you were prepared, spiritually, physically, financially. If you were wealthy or semi-respected, you were mummified. The process took up to 70 days and involved washing the body with palm wine, removing internal organs, storing the stomach, lungs, liver and intestines in canopic jars, discarding the brain, usually through the nose with a metal hook, filling the body with natron, a drying salt, waiting several weeks, stuffing the dried corpse with linen, resin and spices, wrapping every limb with spells and sacred knots, placing protective amulets between layers, sealing it all with resin and a painted death mask. The result? A highly flammable, very sacred linen mummy ready for eternity. Organs didn't stay in the body. Each was stored in a jar guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti, human-headed, protected the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, watched the lungs. Dumutef, jackal-headed, guarded the stomach. Kebesenuef, falcon-headed, watched the intestines, the heart, ideally left in place. It was needed for the final judgment. The brain, not needed, just extra weight. The funeral included a procession with music and mourners, recitation of spells, the opening of the mouth ritual to restore senses in the afterlife, offerings of food, drink, flowers and incense, the sealing of the tomb with solemn ceremony, priests walking in slow, practiced patterns. Your tomb might be a simple pit, if poor, a rock-cut chamber, if middle class, an elaborate tomb or pyramid, if very rich or royal. Inside went food, beer, furniture, clothing, jewellery, makeup, servant statues, shabti, weapons, musical instruments, and probably a mirror. Because even in death, appearances mattered. To make it safely through the afterlife, you needed spells. These were written in the Book of the Dead, or carved on tomb walls, coffins, and amulets. Spells included how to pass 42 gatekeepers, what names to say to which gods, how to transform into a falcon, how to avoid being eaten by a fire-breathing serpent, and how to convince your own heart not to betray you in judgment. It was less rest in peace and more study for eternity. After death, your soul reached the Hall of Judgment. There, before Osiris, you faced the weighing of the heart. Your heart was placed on a scale. Opposite it, the feather of Maat, truth-justice balance. If your heart was lighter, you passed. If heavier, you were fed to Amit, the soul devourer. Amit was part lion, part crocodile, part hippo, all nightmare, no second chances, no appeals, just gulp. To prepare, people memorized the negative confession. I have not killed, I have not lied, I have not stolen temple bread, I have not spit in the river. A cosmic honesty test. If you passed, you entered Aru, the field of reeds, perfect mirror of Egypt but better. No floods, no taxes. Crops grew forever. Food was endless, friends were near. You could nap, dance, sing, or plough fields without sweating. It was beautiful, familiar, and peaceful. But you still needed your shabti figurines, tiny servant statues who would work for you in the afterlife. Because rest was earned. Even in paradise, someone had to tend the onions. If your heart was unbalanced, your soul ceased to exist. No torture, no flames, just erasure. To the Egyptians, this was the ultimate horror, to be forgotten. So they ensured their names lived on, carved into stone, painted on tombs, etched into offerings, whispered by descendants, because memory was immortality. Tombs weren't just graves, they were homes for eternity. That meant jewellery, games, weapons, combs, bread and meat sealed in jars, statues of pets, even model boats to sail the celestial Nile. But all this treasure made tombs targets, which is why some were booby-trapped or hidden behind false walls. Even in death you had to be on guard. So now close your eyes and breathe softly. Your organs are packed, your spells are memorized, your tomb is sealed with care. You've paid the embalmers, you've hired a priest to whisper to your soul, you've convinced your heart to be light. And somewhere in the distance a field of perfect reeds waits. Sleep now, a mitt is full, the gods are watching kindly, and your shabtis are already ploughing the soil in your name. You've worked, you've prayed, you've survived the flood, the fields, and the tax collector. Now it's time to unwind. Because even in ancient Egypt, a land of discipline, duty, and death preparations, people made time for joy. Tonight, we dim the lanterns and step into the quieter corners of the Nile Valley where music played, drinks flowed, and dancers spun beneath the desert moon. Because when life was hard, people partied harder. Music was everywhere, in temples, taverns, workshops, and homes. Instruments included lutes, harps, lyres, flutes, reed pipes, sistra, rattles, drums, and hand clappers. Musicians were often women, especially in temples where music soothed the gods. Songs accompanied work, prayer, childbirth, feasting, grieving, seduction. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was spiritual rhythm, a heartbeat shared with the divine. Dance was both holy ritual and public delight. Temple dancers performed slow symbolic movements, meant to please gods and reenact myth. But outside the temples, dance got lively. Professional dancers performed at banquets, dressed in sheer linen, covered in fragrant oils, hair braided with beads, movements fluid, rhythmic, entrancing. They danced for nobles, priests, pharaohs, and occasionally just for fun. Some wore tattoos, lotus flowers, protective symbols, or sacred animals, inked along the thighs or shoulders. Beer was Egypt's beverage of choice. Made from fermented bread and water, it was cloudy, thick, and nutritious. Children drank it, labourers drank it, pharaohs drank the good stuff. Wine was rarer, reserved for the elite, temples, celebrations, imports from the Levant. At parties, guests were served generously, encouraged to drink deeply, often got very, very merry. One inscription warned, "Be careful with wine, it leads to bad words and fallen sandals." Translation: don't text your ex after a jug of Merlot. A grand feast might include roast duck, spit-roasted goat, bread with honey, lentils and garlic, fresh dates and figs, pomegranates, beer and wine, cakes sweetened with dates or carob. Guests reclined on cushions, servants brought platters, singers performed, dancers twirled, and as the evening grew long someone might stand and recite a love poem or a slightly tipsy hymn to Hathor, goddess of joy and celebration. Leisure wasn't just dancing and drinking, people played games. Most famous, Senet, a board game of strategy and luck. It involved 30 squares, throw sticks as dice, moving pawns to safety, avoiding traps. Senet was both game and spiritual metaphors, a journey to the afterlife with rules no one today fully understands. Other games, hounds and jackals, dice made of knuckle bones, tug-of-war, balancing acts, wrestling matches, some gambled, some lost, and some invented new rules halfway through. Evenings often included storytelling, by firelight beneath the stars or while weaving linen. Stories featured clever peasants, magical boats, talking animals, treacherous siblings, pharaohs in disguise, gods walking among mortals. Poetry was prized, especially romantic verse. I passed by her house, the door was open, and my heart fell into the clay bowl. Subtle? Maybe. Effective? Frequently. Large-scale fun came with religious festivals, which were often more party than piety. Celebrations for gods like Hathor, Bastet, Amun, Osiris. Included parades, music, free food, drinking, dancing in the streets, rituals at temples, and temporary social freedom. Even slaves and servants were allowed to relax. For a moment, everyone became part of the divine dance. Egyptians adored animals. They kept Cats, sacred and spoiled. Dogs, monkeys, gazelles, birds, even crocodiles, safely contained, hopefully. Children played with clay animal toys, puppets, spinning tops, miniature chariots. Adults often found comfort in animals too, especially cats, who guarded homes from snakes and bad dreams. Not all entertainment was loud. Many Egyptians found joy in watching the river, smelling lotus blossoms, playing music alone, sitting with family, listening to wind in palm fronds, sharing figs beneath a tree. Life was hard, so moments of peace were sacred, and even boredom was a gift. So now, feel the lute hum across the night air, the fire is low, the dancers have gone home, a cat curls in your lap purring against your linen tunic. You've eaten, you've laughed, you've spilled wine on your only sandals, but tonight you rest. Because even in the harsh sands of Egypt there was joy, there was rhythm, there was time to dance. Sleep now, the music fades, the candles flicker, and somewhere a flute plays softly just for you. Imagine waking up as the most powerful person in your kingdom. The sun rises for you, the Nile floods for you, the temples chant your name. You are Pharaoh, a living god, a divine ruler, and also a very tired administrator. Because being Pharaoh wasn't all golden crowns and lion thrones. It was ritual. It was expectation. It was pressure. Tonight we quietly follow in the sandal steps of Egypt's higher soul, the one burdened with divinity, surrounded by incense, intrigue, and too many scribes. Pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was Maat personified, order incarnate. He was the son of Ra, the earthly form of Horus, the husband of every goddess, the priest of all temples, the commander of all armies, the final judge in all disputes, and still somehow expected to smile during festivals. To rule Egypt was to embody the universe's balance, keep the Nile flooding, the fields growing, the priests chanting, and the gods appeased. No pressure. Pharaoh's day began early. Attendants woke him with perfumed oils, linen robes, ritual prayers. He performed sacred ablutions. He offered incense to statues. He recited the 42 laws of Maat aloud. Then came briefings with viziers, temple inspections, scribe consultations, review of building projects, and occasionally war planning. Breakfast? A modest plate of bread, fruit, and honeyed beer served with silence and reverence. Pharaoh was Egypt's high priest. He was expected to open temples, present offerings to gods, lead festival parades, fund restoration of shrines, approve priesthood appointments, pray for the people who couldn't enter certain holy places. He didn't always do it himself, but the illusion of personal involvement mattered. Miss a ritual, and the gods might let the Nile dry. Faith was state policy, want to be remembered forever, built in stone. Pharaohs commissioned temples, tombs, obelisks, statues, pyramids in earlier dynasties, palaces, roadways. Each project employed thousands, took years or decades, involved endless accounting. Pharaoh's name was carved on every lintel, every column, every grain silo. Even his enemies' monuments were sometimes chiseled over with his own name. Legacy, carved in sandstone. Behind the divine glow was paperwork. Pharaoh dealt with grain shortages, border disputes, temple politics, labour strikes, Nile misbehaviour, royal family drama, the occasional assassination attempt. Every decision was recorded by scribes. Every decree needed distribution. Every grain tax required tallying. Pharaoh ruled from the palace, but his pen lived in the house of life, the scriptorium where history itself was tamed. Pharaohs were warriors, at least in theory. They were shown, riding chariots, firing bows, trampling enemies beneath divine horses, capturing foreign princes, smashing skulls with ceremonial maces. In reality, Pharaoh often sent generals to fight while he prayed for victory, or sometimes led the first charge, then returned to camp for wine and diplomacy. Famous warrior pharaohs included Thutmose III, Rameses II, Ahmose I. They fought the Hittites, the Libyans, the Nubians, and occasionally their own nobles. Victory meant gold, tribute, praise from priests, and very large dramatic murals. Being divine didn't spare you from family stress. Pharaohs had great royal wives, secondary wives, concubines, daughters to marry off, sons to manage, in-laws with opinions. Royal harems were political tools, marriages created alliances, but love sometimes slipped in, and sometimes someone tried to poison you. Choosing a successor was essential. Ideally, your son would worship you, continue your monuments, not erase your name, and survive your jealous courtiers. But dynasties were fragile. Internal coups, sibling rivalries, priesthood meddling, false heirs, even harem conspiracies. Pharaohs wrote wills, built elaborate tombs, commissioned magic statues to defend their names in the afterlife. Because the greatest fear wasn't death, it was being forgotten. Pharaoh had spies, but also enemies with knives. Threats included disloyal viziers, ambitious generals, foreign agents, jealous brothers, underpaid guards, slightly vengeful priests. Security meant guarded chambers, food testers, night rituals, and plenty of walls. One pharaoh, Ramesses III, was nearly overthrown in the harem conspiracy, a plot involving wives, scribes, and poisoned ointments. Divinity was not immunity. When Pharaoh died, the machine roared into motion. He became Osiris, Lord of the afterlife, judge of the dead, eternal ruler. He was mummified, buried in a sacred tomb and given spells, given statues, given eternal offerings, hopefully. And in temples, priests continued to speak his name, offer his favourite bread, whisper his titles, because even gods need marketing. So now you sit upon the golden throne, the incense curls around your head, the scribes bow low, the priests chant, your daughter just married the prince of Nubia, and in the corner your enemies sharpen their patience. To rule Egypt was to rule the world, and never rest. Sleep now. Your cartouches are carved, your car is strong, and your shabti are waiting in the field of reeds. The sun is blinding, the wind is dry, and yes, there's sand in your eyes, your sandals, your bread, your nose, your everything. You're in Egypt. Not just any Egypt, ancient Egypt, where the landscape shaped everything, from what people wore to how they lived, to how quickly they aged. Tonight, we wander across the geography of this ancient land, the flooding river, the golden desert, the blessed delta, and all the reasons why living there meant sweating constantly and sweeping forever. Because Egypt wasn't just ruled by pharaohs, it was ruled by climate. Egypt was famously divided into two regions. Upper Egypt, the south, where the Nile begins to narrow through rocky cliffs and valleys. Lower Egypt, the north, home to the Nile Delta, fertile and green and full of reeds. Confusing? Yes, because the Nile flows south to north, toward the Mediterranean. So upper meant upstream and lower meant downriver. Each region had unique customs, local deities, political centres, regional accents probably. But both were hot, dry and sand-filled. Unity came from the river. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was everything. It provided water for crops and animals. It enabled travel and trade. It fertilized the land. It dictated the calendar. It inspired myths. It delivered both life and destruction. Each year it flooded predictably. This inundation was a blessing. But if it flooded too little, famine, too much, disaster. People built canals, irrigation systems, nilometers, stone pillars to measure water levels. The Nile was friend, father, transport route, trash disposal system, and spiritual metaphor. Without it, Egypt would be just sand. To the east and west of the Nile, desert. Golden, endless, hostile. The eastern desert led to the Red Sea and trade routes. The western desert was vast and full of mystery, with oases scattered like lost coins. The desert protected Egypt from invaders, supplied minerals and stones, was home to nomads and traders, inspired fear and reverence. But mostly it dumped sand into every aspect of daily life. Sand in your food, sand in your hair, sand in your pillow, sand in your carefully sealed tomb. No matter how many brooms you had, you always needed one more. Egypt was hot, blisteringly so. Summer highs regularly reached 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. There was almost no rain. The air was dry, excellent for preserving mummies. Shade was precious. Linen was essential. The sun became more than a weather pattern. It became a god. Ra, the sun god, travelled the sky by day, then fought darkness by night. People prayed to him for light, health, protection, prosperity, but also for clouds. The desert wasn't still. Winds, especially the Kamzun, could be brutal. Hot, dry, dusty, full of static electricity, and capable of turning midday into sandstorm twilight. These winds damaged crops, scoured skin, filled nostrils, uprooted tents, howled through windows, made donkeys very, very grumpy. Egypt rarely saw storms, but when they came, they were loud and left a film of dust on absolutely everything. Egypt's farming depended entirely on the Nile's rhythm. 3 seasons structured the year. Achet, the inundation, June to September. Pere, the growing season, October to February. Shemu, the harvest, March to May. Farmers, planted when the floodwaters receded, grew wheat, barley, flax, onions, garlic, lettuce, and more. Relied on water wheels and shadufs for irrigation. Lived by the rhythm of planting, weeding, reaping, resting. Missed the timing, no crops, no bread, no offerings, no patience from your children. Egypt had limestone, granite, sandstone, gold, copper, alabaster, natron salt for mummification. Clay, it didn't have much wood, good rainfall, natural forests, or a lot of shade. Timber was imported. Most homes were mud brick. Luxury, a palm tree near your courtyard. Egypt didn't have many earthquakes or volcanoes, but it had its share of dangers. Crocodiles in the Nile, hippopotamuses, deceptively cute, incredibly lethal, snakes and scorpions, flash floods in desert valleys, plagues of locusts, mouldy grain from poor storage, dust blindness, heat stroke. Sometimes the land gave, sometimes it took. Moving round Egypt meant boats on the Nile, donkeys on land, sandals with calloused feet, and a lot of water jars. Boats were essential, papyrus skiffs for locals, wooden ships for nobles, trade vessels for foreign goods. Desert travel, camels didn't arrive until late. Early Egyptians relied on foot and donkey. Long journeys required shade cloth, maps scratched into memory, and probably divine patience. So now feel the warmth of ancient stone under your feet. Dust settles in the air, the Nile glimmers to your left. The wind whispers of grain, gods, and forgotten sandals. You're in the land of eternal sun, where death waited quietly, but life was noisy, hot, and full of sand. Sleep now, the wind has calmed, the Nile hums softly, and the dunes curl like waves beneath the moon. You've survived. You've endured the sandstorms, the floods, the taxes, the pharaoh's decrees, the plagues of flies, the plagues of priests, and the occasional spoiled jar of lentil stew. You've tilled the soil, you've carried bricks, you've said the prayers and whispered the spells, you've lived your days under a sun that never blinked. And somehow, despite the dust, the labour, the divine bureaucracy, there was beauty. Tonight, in this final breath of our journey, we lie back beneath the same stars the ancients saw and remember. Life may have sucked, but it also shimmered. Amid the burdens there were moments, small things. A fresh loaf, warm and dense from a neighbour's oven. A child's giggle chasing a kitten across the courtyard. A single lotus blossom floating in a carved clay bowl. The quiet joy of surviving another harvest. The rare pleasure of shade beneath a fig tree. The way the Nile gleamed just before sunset. A good dream, remembered in the morning. Ancient Egyptians understood joy wasn't in more, it was in enough. Everything meant something. The colour of your amulet, the words of a blessing, the way incense curled in the air, the placement of a cup in a shrine, the sequence of a funeral chant, the name whispered over bread before it was shared. This was not a thoughtless culture. Even in poverty, life was infused with ritual, not because the gods needed it, but because people did. Ritual created rhythm, and rhythm helped the days feel less arbitrary. They painted their walls, they decorated their coffins, they carved their names into everything. Was it vanity? Maybe. But also, it was resistance, against time, against oblivion. When life was hard, beauty was a form of rebellion. They wore jewellery even while sweating in fields. They perfumed their wigs with resin and myrrh. They lined their eyes with kohl not just to reduce glare, but because looking good was a spiritual act. To be human was to be seen, even by the gods. Egyptians didn't fear death as final. They feared being forgotten. That's why names mattered, why tombs bore carvings, why statues stared eternally forward. They built cities of the dead so memory could live. Death was a continuation, an opportunity to reunite with ancestors, to rest under fig trees that never shed leaves, to sail forever on the celestial Nile. It was exhausting, yes. There were still field assignments in the afterlife, but there was peace, and your cat would be waiting. At the heart of everything was Ma'at, the cosmic order. It wasn't just truth or justice, it was balance, between day and night, between chaos and peace, between rich and poor, between gods and humans, between the seen and unseen. Ma'at wasn't just a word. It was the compass of existence. Even when floods failed and locusts came, they clung to this principle, that balance could return, that the world could right itself again. Ancient Egypt didn't just leave pyramids, it left echoes, in how we bury our dead, in the calendar we follow, in the medicines we use, in the stories we retell, in the gods that echo through mythologies, in the architecture of temples and the shape of dreams. You can hear Egypt in every museum, every ancient novel, every eye drawn in eyeliner. It's not forgotten, because they refuse to be. So, yes, life in ancient Egypt often sucked. You were born into labour, you bathed in the river with crocodiles, you fought floods, dust and disease. You paid taxes in grain and kept hoping your neighbour wouldn't curse your cow. But you also danced, you sang, you fell in love, you saw the stars shimmer above temple columns, you believed your soul had worth, you believed you mattered, to your family, to the gods, to the fabric of time. You tried, and sometimes you smiled. That too is history. So now curl beneath your linen sheet. The fire is low, the fields are quiet, and the gods are watching gently, not judging, just remembering. You lived in the land of gold and shadow. You carried burdens and blessings. You tasted dust and honey. You whispered prayers into wind, and you left your name behind. It is enough. Sleep now. The journey is complete. The Nile still flows. And in the hush between stars, a boat awaits to carry you through dreams, lit by oil lamps and moonlight.